It was just a stupid party game. It wasn't a real kiss. I laughed because it was awkward, not because I liked it. He's being dramatic, right? Everyone was watching. What was I supposed to do? Punch his friend? The night started perfectly normal. We danced together, shared drinks, played beer pong against another couple, and absolutely crushed them. David kept pulling me close and whispering funny observations about other people at the party, making me giggle into his shoulder. I felt so connected to him, so happy to be there with him, showing everyone how solid we were as a couple. But then the alcohol started flowing more freely, and someone suggested party games. You know how it is when everyone's had a few drinks and wants to do something more interactive than just standing around talking. First, it was charades, which was hilarious because everyone was too drunk to act out anything coherently. Then someone mentioned truth or dare, but that got shot down as too juvenile. That's when Marcus, Jake's roommate, shouted out the fateful suggestion that would ruin my entire life: spin the bottle. The whole room erupted in cheers and laughter, everyone suddenly excited about this throwback to middle school party games. People started clearing space on the living room floor, pushing furniture out of the way, forming a circle, like we were teenagers again. I looked at David to gauge his reaction, and he was laughing along with everyone else, shaking his head in that amused way that meant he thought it was silly but fun. He didn't seem concerned at all, which made me feel confident that this was just harmless party entertainment. If he was okay with it, then obviously there was nothing to worry about. The bottle started making its rounds, landing on various couples and friends, creating these quick, awkward pecks that everyone laughed about. Sarah had to kiss Mike, her ex from sophomore year, which was weird but funny. Jenny spun and got her roommate Lisa, and they did this dramatic fake makeout that had everyone dying with laughter. It was all so light-hearted and ridiculous. When the bottle came to me, I remember feeling this little flutter of nervous excitement, not because I wanted to kiss anyone else. I was completely happy with David, but because there's always that anticipation when you're about to do something unpredictable in front of a crowd. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen. I gave the bottle a good spin, watching it rotate around and around, catching glimpses of faces as it passed them. Please land on David, I thought. That would be perfect. I could kiss my own boyfriend, and everyone would laugh about how anticlimactic it was. But the bottle slowed down, wobbled, and came to a stop pointing directly at Tyler. Tyler, David's best friend since childhood. The guy who'd been David's roommate for 2 years, who came to every party with us, who I'd probably hung out with hundreds of times in group settings. He was practically like a brother to me at that point. Familiar, safe, completely non-threatening. The room erupted in cheers and chants. People started shouting for us to kiss, clapping their hands, making it into this big theatrical moment. Tyler looked as surprised as I felt, his eyebrows shooting up as he pointed to himself, like he couldn't believe the bottle had chosen him. I glanced over at David, expecting to see him laughing along with everyone else, maybe making some joke about the situation, but his expression was harder to read than I expected. He wasn't smiling exactly, but he wasn't frowning either. He looked neutral, waiting to see what would happen. The crowd kept chanting, getting louder and more insistent. This was clearly what was expected to happen. The whole point of the game was that you had to kiss whoever the bottle chose, regardless of your relationship status or comfort level. That was literally the only rule. To refuse would be like ruining the entire game for everyone, making me look uptight and no fun. Tyler scooted closer to me in the circle, and I could see he was trying to be respectful about the whole thing. He wasn't leering or making it weird. He looked almost as awkward as I felt. This was just a friend doing what the game required, nothing more than that. So I leaned in to meet him halfway, and we kissed. It was quick, probably lasted less than 3 seconds. Completely innocent, just lips touching briefly, with no tongue or passion or anything that could be considered romantic. Exactly what you'd expect from a party game kiss between 2 people who were just friends. But here's where everything went wrong, apparently. When we pulled apart, I felt this wave of nervous energy from the whole situation. The crowd watching, the awkwardness of kissing someone who wasn't my boyfriend, the relief that it was over and hadn't been weird. So I laughed. Just a natural tension-releasing giggle that bubbled up without me really thinking about it. And then, still caught up in that giddy moment, still playing to the crowd that was whooping and cheering, I turned to David with a big smile and said something that I thought was funny and flirty. I told him that, oops, I guess his best friend wasn't too bad at kissing. I meant it as a joke, a way to acknowledge what had just happened while also making it clear that it was no big deal, just silly party game nonsense that we could all laugh about together. I thought David would roll his eyes and make some comeback about how Tyler had probably been practicing on his pillow or something equally ridiculous. Instead, the entire room went dead silent. David's face changed completely. The neutral expression vanished, replaced by something cold and distant that I'd never seen before. His eyes went flat, like shutters closing, and for a moment he just stared at me like he didn't recognize who I was. Then, without saying a single word, he stood up and walked out of the room. I sat there in the circle, surrounded by our friends, feeling the energy drain out of the party like someone had pulled a plug. People started looking uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact, suddenly very interested in their drinks. The fun, carefree atmosphere evaporated instantly. Someone made a weak attempt to restart the game, but it was obvious that the mood was ruined. People started drifting away from the circle, breaking into smaller conversations, pretending like nothing had happened. But I could feel their glances, their whispered comments, their judgment settling over me like a heavy blanket. I pushed myself up from the floor and went looking for David, my heart racing with confusion and growing panic. What had I done wrong? It was just a game, just a stupid, meaningless party game that everyone had been participating in. Why was he acting like I had betrayed him somehow? I found him in Jake's bedroom, yanking my suitcase out from under the bed where I'd stashed it earlier. We'd planned to spend the night at the party and drive home together in the morning, so I'd brought an overnight bag with my clothes and toiletries. Now he was throwing my stuff into it with sharp, angry movements. The sight of him packing my things hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just walking away to cool off. This was him actively removing me from his life, from our plans, from everything we'd built together over the past year. I started to ask what he was doing, but the words died in my throat when he looked up at me. The David I knew, warm, funny, patient David, who always tried to see the best in everyone, was completely gone. In his place was the stranger with ice in his eyes and contempt written across every feature. He zipped up the suitcase with one sharp motion and lifted it off the bed. Following him outside was one of the most humiliating experiences of my entire life. The party was still going on inside. I could hear the music, the laughter, the conversations continuing without us. But out here on the front steps, it felt like the world had ended. David was already at the bottom of the stairs, setting my suitcase down on the sidewalk with more force than necessary. The sound it made when it hit the concrete was so final, so definitive, like a door slamming shut on everything we'd been together. I was still trying to process what was happening, still caught between confusion and the beginning stages of real panic. This had to be some kind of overreaction that we could talk through once he calmed down. David wasn't the type to end relationships over party games. He was reasonable, understanding, willing to communicate through problems. Except the person standing on that sidewalk wasn't the David I thought I knew. When I tried to approach him, tried to start some kind of conversation about why he was being so dramatic, he didn't even look at me. Just told me that if I thought humiliating him in front of all our friends was funny, maybe I'd find sleeping outside equally amusing. The words hit me like a slap. Humiliating him? I'd played a party game. I'd done exactly what everyone else had done, what the entire room had been encouraging me to do. How was that humiliating anyone? But he was already walking back toward the house, leaving me standing there on the sidewalk in my party dress and heels, staring at a suitcase full of my belongings, like it was some kind of alien artifact. The front door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than if he'd slammed it. I stood there for probably 10 minutes, waiting for him to come back out, waiting for someone to emerge from the party and tell me this was all some elaborate joke, waiting for the universe to reset itself and let me go back to 2 hours ago when everything was fine. But nobody came. The party continued without us, and I was left alone on a street corner at midnight, holding my phone and trying to figure out what the hell had just happened to my life. My first instinct was to call him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried texting, sending message after message, explaining that it was just a game, that it didn't mean anything, that I was sorry if I'd hurt his feelings somehow. But the messages just sat there, unread and unanswered. Eventually, I had to call an Uber to take me back to my dorm room, dragging my suitcase through campus like some kind of walk of shame. My roommate was already asleep, so I had to creep around in the dark, trying not to wake her while I processed the complete destruction of my relationship. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying the kiss, my laugh, David's face when I made that stupid comment, trying to figure out where exactly everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. The next morning brought a whole new level of humiliation that I hadn't even considered the night before. Social media. Someone at the party had recorded the kiss. Not just the kiss itself, but my reaction afterward. The laugh, the comment to David, his face as he processed what I'd said. The whole devastating sequence was captured in crystal clear video and had already started making rounds through our social circle. I discovered this when I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, most from people I barely knew, all asking if I was okay or telling me they'd seen the video. My stomach dropped as I realized that our private relationship drama had become public entertainment. The video itself was even worse than I remembered. Watching it from an outside perspective, I could see how my laugh might have looked, how the comment might have sounded. There was something about the way I'd turned to David, something in my expression that looked almost triumphant, like I was proud of what had just happened. That wasn't how I'd felt at all, but I couldn't deny how it appeared on camera. I spent the entire morning trying to do damage control, reaching out to mutual friends, trying to explain my side of the story. But most people weren't interested in hearing explanations. They'd seen what they'd seen, and they'd already made up their minds about what kind of person I was. The responses I got ranged from politely distant to outright hostile. People who'd been friendly with me for years suddenly couldn't be bothered to respond to my texts. Others sent back messages that were clearly designed to end the conversation as quickly as possible. Sarah, who I'd considered one of my closest friends, finally agreed to meet me for coffee that afternoon. I thought she would be sympathetic, would help me figure out how to fix this disaster. Instead, she spent 20 minutes explaining why everyone was talking about how disrespectful I'd been. According to Sarah, it wasn't about the kiss itself. Everyone understood that party games sometimes put you in awkward situations. It was about how I'd handled it afterward. The laugh that seemed to indicate I'd enjoyed it. The comment that made it sound like I was comparing David unfavorably to his best friend. The way I'd turned the whole thing into a joke at David's expense. When I tried to explain that it hadn't been malicious, that I was just nervous and trying to lighten the mood, Sarah gave me this look, like I was being deliberately obtuse. She told me that maybe I needed to think about why my first instinct was to laugh about kissing another man in front of my boyfriend, instead of being embarrassed or apologetic. That afternoon, in a fit of frustration and self-righteousness, I posted on Instagram. I put up a story about how men who couldn't handle confident women weren't real men at all, about how insecurity was the most unattractive trait someone could have, about how I wasn't going to apologize for being comfortable with myself and my sexuality. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. People started commenting on the post, sharing screenshots in group chats, sending me direct messages about what a terrible person I was. The consensus seemed to be that I was completely delusional if I thought this was about confidence or insecurity, and that I was making everything worse by doubling down instead of admitting I'd messed up. Someone had screen recorded my Instagram story and posted it to TikTok with a caption about the most tone-deaf response to relationship drama they'd ever seen. That video got thousands of views and hundreds of comments, almost all of them dragging me for my complete lack of self-awareness. The comments on that TikTok were brutal. People called me narcissistic, toxic, completely lacking in empathy. They said I was the type of girl who would cheat and then blame her boyfriend for being too controlling. They analyzed the original party video frame by frame, pointing out every micro-expression and gesture that proved I'd enjoyed humiliating David. Some people even started digging into my other social media accounts, finding old posts and photos to support their narrative about what kind of person I was. They found pictures of me with other guys at parties, harmless friend photos that they recontextualized as evidence of my disloyalty. They found posts about feminism and confidence that they twisted into proof of my selfishness and lack of respect for relationships. Within 48 hours, I'd gone from being just another college student to being the subject of internet hate that extended far beyond my own social circle. Complete strangers were making videos about me, using me as an example of everything wrong with modern dating culture. And through all of this, David remained completely silent. He didn't defend me, but he also didn't pile on or contribute to the narrative. He just disappeared from social media entirely, which somehow made his judgment feel even more devastating than if he'd posted angry rants about what I'd done. By the end of that week, I was desperate enough to show up at his apartment unannounced. I'd tried every other form of communication: calls, texts, emails, even reaching out through mutual friends, and got to nothing but silence in return. Showing up in person felt like my last chance to make him understand what had really happened, to explain my perspective, and hopefully salvage something from the wreckage of our relationship. I'd spent hours preparing what I was going to say. I had talking points about how party games weren't real life, about how my reaction had been nervous laughter rather than genuine amusement, about how much I loved him and would never intentionally hurt him. I'd practiced different versions of the conversation in my mirror, trying to find the right combination of apology and explanation that would make him forgive me. But when he opened the door, all my carefully rehearsed words died in my throat. David looked tired, not just physically tired, though there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. He looked emotionally exhausted, worn down in a way that made him seem older than his 21 years. When he saw me standing there, his expression didn't change at all. No surprise, no anger, no hope. Just resignation, like he'd been expecting this but wished it wasn't happening. I started babbling immediately, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I told him it didn't mean anything, that it was just part of the game, that everyone had been participating, and I'd just done what was expected. I explained about the nervous laughter, about how the comment was meant to be flirty banter rather than genuine comparison, about how sorry I was that he'd misunderstood my intentions. He let me talk for maybe 2 minutes before holding up a hand to stop me. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, in a way that was somehow more devastating than if he'd been yelling. He told me that I still didn't get it, that it had never been about the kiss itself. He understood that party games sometimes created awkward situations, and he wasn't so insecure that he'd end a relationship over a 3-second peck between friends. The problem, he explained, was what had happened after the kiss. How I'd laughed like the whole situation was hilarious rather than awkward. How I'd made that comment that positioned him as the joke, the boyfriend who was being shown up by his own best friend. How I'd turned what should have been an uncomfortable moment for everyone involved into entertainment at his expense. But the worst part, he said, was that when I'd looked at him after making that comment, I'd been smiling. Not embarrassed, not apologetic, not uncomfortable about what had just happened. I'd looked pleased with myself, like I'd accomplished something or proven some kind of point. He told me that in that moment, he'd realized he didn't know who I was anymore. The person he'd been dating for a year would have been mortified about having to kiss someone else in front of him, would have immediately tried to make it clear that it meant nothing, would have been focused on his comfort rather than entertaining the crowd. Instead, I'd acted like humiliating him was funny, like his feelings were less important than getting a laugh from our friends. When I tried to interrupt, to explain that it hadn't been intentional, he shook his head and kept talking. He said that maybe the most telling part was how I'd reacted afterward, not with genuine remorse about hurting him, but with anger about his response. Instead of trying to understand why he was upset, I'd immediately gone on the defensive, posting on social media about how he was being dramatic and insecure. That Instagram story, he said, had told him everything he needed to know about how I really felt. I'd been more concerned with being right than with repairing the damage I'd caused. He was right, and I knew he was right, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it out loud. Instead, I kept trying to explain, to justify, to make him see that my intentions had been good even if my execution was poor. But he was done listening. He told me that he'd spent the past week thinking about our entire relationship, looking back at other moments with fresh eyes, and he'd started to notice a pattern. Times when I'd prioritized being seen as fun and confident over considering his feelings. Times when I'd dismissed his concerns as insecurity or jealousy. Times when I'd made him feel like his emotional needs were inconvenient obstacles to my social performance. The kiss wasn't an isolated incident, he said. It was just the moment when he'd finally seen clearly what I'd been doing all along. He wished me luck and happiness, but he was done. There was nothing left to discuss. The door closed with that same soft click I'd heard at the party, and I was alone on another doorstep with another suitcase, watching another relationship end in the space between one heartbeat and the next. David was right about everything. I had humiliated him, not through malice, but through thoughtlessness and selfishness. I had prioritized my image over his feelings, my social performance over his emotional well-being. I had turned his legitimate hurt into evidence of his inadequacy rather than examining my own behavior. And now I had to live with the consequences of those choices, the knowledge that I'd destroyed something good because I'd been too immature and self-absorbed to recognize its value while I had it. The suitcase sat in the corner of Emma's guest room, like a monument to everything I'd lost. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the sound it had made hitting the sidewalk, the finality of David zipping it closed, the way he'd packed my life away from his, with efficient, devastating precision. He'd been right about the kiss being meaningless, but he'd also been right that my reaction afterward had revealed something much more significant about who I was and what I valued. And apparently, what I valued wasn't him.